In 1962, Brian Epstein walked in my office with a record of this group called the Beatles, which I thought was such a stupid name.
George Martin was the one who opened the door for the Beatles to explore their own creative universe. He didn't just shape how they recorded or structured their music. He pioneered techniques that helped the band push beyond the limits of 1960s pop. Among the Beatles, it was Paul McCartney with whom Martin shared the closest connection. McCartney was a perfectionist, controlling, bold, and constantly bursting with ideas. Though Martin was involved in hundreds of sessions, he rarely spoke publicly about the bond he shared with McCartney. What we know comes mainly from studio notes, secondhand accounts, or behind-the-scenes footage. Behind their iconic partnership lay countless disagreements, compromises, and moments of adjustment. Martin once referred to himself as McCartney's musical translator, but their relationship was far more complex. And now we'll open the door to that story. June 6, 1962, EMI Studios, Abbey Road, London. The Beatles arrived for their first recording audition. George Martin, then a producer at Parlophone, a modest EMI label, was tasked with assessing the young Liverpool band. He wasn't fully convinced by their sound, but one member stood out: Paul McCartney. While John Lennon remained cautious and George Harrison mostly quiet, McCartney stood out by engaging with technicians, asking detailed questions about recording, and offering suggestions about harmonies and orchestration. Martin, used to complete control in the studio, found this behavior unusual. McCartney had a head full of ideas, but lacked focus, and he wasn't easily swayed. Disagreements appeared early. Martin wasn't impressed with Love Me Do, finding it too simplistic. McCartney, however, defended it passionately. In the end, compromises were made, the tempo was altered, and the harmonica was moved up. Unexpectedly, the song became a hit, prompting both sides to reassess their views of each other. One of Martin's first significant contributions was suggesting Ringo Starr replace Pete Best. It wasn't an easy call, but Martin believed a more adaptable drummer was essential. McCartney resisted at first, but eventually agreed. This marked the start of a more stable lineup and showed Martin's readiness to make tough, lasting decisions. In those early days, Martin kept detailed notes after each session. His entries about McCartney often praised his control, strong work ethic, and maturity beyond his age. Years later, Martin recalled, "Paul was the only one who ever made me explain why an idea wouldn't work." Their early collaboration was full of clashes over tempo, key, and technique. But from those conflicts, respect grew. McCartney didn't blindly follow. He listened. Martin didn't impose. He reasoned. Their bond wasn't built on similarity, but on a functional coexistence. As trust grew, so did clarity. Their work evolved into a powerful collaborative force, setting the stage for one of the most creative periods in pop music history. From Rubber Soul to Revolver to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. During this golden era, McCartney and Martin's partnership became a seamless blend of skill and imagination. McCartney no longer just brought songs, he brought soundscapes. Martin didn't restrain this creative surge, he shaped it. When McCartney introduced Eleanor Rigby, Martin scrapped traditional instruments and arranged a stark 8-piece string ensemble, evoking the style of Bartók. No background, no drums, cinematic yet urgent. Martin wasn't just an executive of ideas. He set boundaries. For no one. McCartney recorded nearly everything himself. Still, Martin added a French horn to balance the piece and brought in Alan Civil from the London Symphony Orchestra to nail it in 4 takes. Boundaries for Martin kept songs from becoming bloated. A Day in the Life exemplified their synergy. Martin connected Lennon's and McCartney's fragments with a 40-piece orchestra building chaotic suspense over 24 bars. Musicians wore masks and wild outfits. Martin managed the volume and tape effects to stretch the final chord for nearly a minute without distortion. They operated like dual poles of a machine, one asking "what if" and the other responding with technical finesse. Disagreements weren't personal. When McCartney proposed reverse tape in Rain, Martin didn't oppose. He simply asked for a test. McCartney agreed. The result, a defining Beatles sound. Still, not everything went smoothly. McCartney often came in with half-baked ideas and napkin-scribbled chords. Martin never refused, but made terms clear. If time was tight, orchestration had to be minimal. Their push-pull dynamic preserved both spontaneity and structure. Their success came not from sameness, but from understanding how to channel their differences. The White Album marked a turning point. A sprawling, chaotic masterpiece with 30 wildly different tracks, most developed in isolation. The unified band that once thrived under Martin's direction was dissolving. Martin found himself increasingly sidelined. McCartney, seeking to keep momentum alive, tightened control. He arrived with finished arrangements, recorded alone, and worked with engineers outside of Martin's supervision. Songs like Martha, My Dear were recorded without any other Beatles present. Martin, though outwardly composed, privately showed his fatigue. Reflecting on the sessions, Martin said they were no longer a band, and I was no longer the producer. Tensions mounted. Sound engineer Jeff Emmerich quit after McCartney demanded a bass redo, while Lennon and Harrison were absent. Feeling disrespected and overwhelmed, Emmerich walked out. Martin didn't stop him. The collapse was clear. Even creative moments came from unexpected places. When McCartney requested a full overhaul of Abladier, Lennon, who disliked the song, stormed in, played his own piano intro, and changed everything. McCartney accepted it instantly. Martin recorded it in one session. A rare spark in a tense period driven by spontaneity, not planning, letting go, let it be, and the end. Martin was barely involved in the Let It Be project. The recordings and film were managed by an external team. When the initial mix fell apart, Phil Spector was brought in to salvage it. Though McCartney agreed at first, he was furious with the final mix, especially the lush strings on the long and winding road. He called Martin and said, "I no longer recognize my own song." Martin replied calmly, "You gave it to someone else, Paul." It was one of the rare moments Martin openly commented on a Beatles production he hadn't overseen. He didn't criticize anyone, but he began turning down future Beatles projects. Not out of bitterness, but because he understood that his chapter had ended. Whether their relationship could ever return to what it once was remained unclear. But when they were no longer bound by the name The Beatles, they found each other again, this time as independent artists. Their collaboration was timeless, not because it was easy, but because it showed how two contrasting forces could come together to create something that neither could have achieved alone. A connection between two souls, Paul McCartney and George Martin. In 1970, when the Beatles officially disbanded, it wasn't just the end of a legendary band. It marked the closing of countless chapters, including friendships and creative partnerships. But one bond remained resilient: the connection between George Martin and Paul McCartney. Their collaboration didn't end. It simply evolved. Freed from the internal politics and pressures of the Beatles, their partnership became something deeper. No longer dictated by hierarchy or band dynamics, they worked as two seasoned artists, equals crafting music with a new kind of freedom. A turning point came in 1973. McCartney was asked to write the theme for Live and Let Die, one of the most iconic James Bond films. He personally invited George Martin to produce the track, marking their first official collaboration since Abbey Road. This time, it was just the two of them. No Lennon, no Harrison, no Abbey Road studio. The scenery had changed, but their roles remained clear. McCartney brought the melody, chorus, and core idea, while Martin handled orchestration, arrangement, and the transitions that gave the song its cinematic power. The result, a standout hit, not just among Bond themes, but a milestone in 1970s film music. In the 1980s, following the end of the Wings era, McCartney once again turned to Martin for direction. Now, in his 50s, Martin still brought the same meticulous attention to detail. Their collaboration on Tug of War, 1982, and Pipes of Peace, 1983, reflected a working relationship that had matured beautifully, free of past tensions, grounded in mutual trust. Martin wasn't just a producer anymore. He became a creative partner, helping shape the album's concepts, select tracks, and even recommend collaborators. For Tug of War, it was Martin who suggested bringing in Stevie Wonder for the daring duet, "What's That You're Doing?" McCartney trusted him completely. The album was later hailed as McCartney's finest post-Beatles work, and George Martin was a key part of that success. Their relationship wasn't one of public displays or constant companionship. They didn't appear together often or share personal stories in the press. Yet those close to them knew they stayed connected through letters, phone calls, and shared work. George's son, Giles Martin, once revealed that his father kept a shelf dedicated to Paul's demo tapes, not to archive them, but simply because hearing them made him happy. Even after they stopped working regularly, Martin held deep respect for McCartney. When asked who had taught him the most, he answered without hesitation, "Paul. He always knew exactly what he wanted." Martin said, "My job was to find a way to make that happen." In a world where creative clashes are common, their decades-long collaboration stood out, not for its warmth or friendship, but for the rare, quiet power of mutual respect. Each man knew his role and honored the others. When George Martin passed away on March 8, 2016, McCartney didn't hold a public memorial. Instead, he shared a short but powerful tribute. He was a true gentleman. Later, he organized a private gathering at a small chapel in Oxfordshire. No press, no speeches, just a few friends, a piano, and one unreleased demo from 1981, edited by Martin himself. The note on the tape read, "Unfinished but honest enough." From that moment on, McCartney began to mention Martin more often, not with cliché praise, but as a constant point of reference. When speaking about orchestration or arrangement, he'd recall Martin's advice how to balance electronic with acoustic instruments, how to use silence as structure. Even when Martin had disagreed with him, McCartney remembered those moments with gratitude. Martin's challenges weren't rejections. They were careful reflections. To Paul, George Martin wasn't just a producer who had passed on. He had become a guiding voice. In a 2022 conversation with Giles Martin, Paul shared that he still hears George's voice when composing. "Sometimes I want to add strings at the end of a song, and in my head I hear him ask, 'Are you doing this for the song or just to prove something?'" That voice became even more important as music entered the age of artificial intelligence. At a UK Parliament hearing in 2023, McCartney was asked if AI could replicate Martin. He shook his head. "No way. We used to sit in silence for hours. No machine understands the meaning of those silences." After George's passing, some handwritten notes were shared by his family. In one, he wrote, "Paul is not easy to work with," but he added, "that very insecurity kept me from being careless." If he was demanding, it was because he didn't want to lose what the music was waiting for. In another note, "I orchestrated the process, but he brought the reason for that process to exist." There was no grand farewell, no final letter. Yet, in every reaction McCartney showed when mentioning Martin, and in every page Martin wrote about Paul, there was evidence of a bond that needed no dramatic ending. It wasn't based on emotion, but on standards, on trust. Their connection was not just a friendship or a collaboration. It was a symbiosis, a union of vision and discipline, art and structure. They may have paused, clashed, or gone separate ways at times, but they never denied each other's place in their shared creative legacy. And though only one of them remains on that journey, the other is still there. An invisible compass, a quiet voice, a lasting standard for how a song should be.